Sarah Mitchell stood behind the pharmacy counter, her fingers trembling slightly as she counted pills into an orange bottle. She could feel the stares burning into her skin like hot coals. 3 teenage girls huddled near the vitamin aisle, whispering and giggling while pointing in her direction. Sarah kept her eyes down, focusing on the prescription label in front of her. She had learned over the past 2 years that ignoring them was often the best strategy. The small tribal tattoo on her left cheek had become both her identity and her burden. It was barely 2 inches long, a delicate pattern of interwoven lines that curved from her cheekbone toward her ear. To some people, it was beautiful. To others, it was a mark of rebellion, unprofessionalism, or worse. Sarah had heard it all since returning to her hometown of Riverside, a quiet community nestled in the mountains of North Carolina. "Can you believe they let someone like that work here?" one of the teenage girls said, her voice intentionally loud enough to carry across the store. "I mean, what kind of person puts a tattoo on their face?" Sarah's coworker, Emma, glanced over with sympathetic eyes. Emma was only 19, fresh out of high school, and she had witnessed these moments more times than she could count. She started to move toward the girls, ready to defend Sarah, but Sarah gave her a subtle shake of the head. It wasn't worth it. It never was. The truth behind Sarah's tattoo was something she rarely shared. It wasn't a drunken mistake from her college years or a rebellious statement against society. The tattoo was a tribute, a permanent reminder of a promise she had made to someone who had saved her life in the most unexpected way. But explaining that to strangers in a pharmacy felt impossible. How could she make them understand the depth of meaning behind those simple lines? Sarah finished filling the prescription and called out the customer's name. An elderly man approached the counter, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile when he saw her. Mr. Peterson had been coming to this pharmacy for 15 years, and he had never once treated Sarah differently because of her tattoo. "How are you today, Sarah?" he asked, his voice gentle and kind. "I'm doing well, Mr. Peterson. How's your wife feeling?" Sarah replied, grateful for his normalcy. "Much better, thank you for asking. Those new medications you recommended really helped her arthritis." He paid for his prescription and patted her hand before leaving. "You're doing a great job here. Don't let anyone tell you different." Sarah smiled genuinely for the first time that day. If only everyone could be like Mr. Peterson. But she knew the reality. Her face tattoo had cost her 3 job interviews before this pharmacy finally hired her. She had been asked to leave a restaurant once because her appearance made other customers uncomfortable. Parents pulled their children away from her at the grocery store. Old friends from high school crossed the street to avoid talking to her. The afternoon shift dragged on slowly. Sarah helped customers, restocked shelves, and answered phone calls about prescriptions. Every task was performed with quiet efficiency, her mind occasionally drifting back to the islands, to the heat and the sand, to the moment when everything changed. As closing time approached, the pharmacy grew quieter. Emma was in the back room organizing inventory. Sarah was alone at the front counter when the door chimed, announcing a new customer. She looked up and felt her breath catch in her throat. A tall man in his late 50s entered the store. He wore civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple button-down shirt, but something about his posture screamed military. His hair was short and graying at the temples, and his eyes held the sharp, observant quality of someone who had spent decades making life-or-death decisions. He walked with purpose, scanning the store with practiced efficiency before his gaze landed on Sarah. For a moment, neither of them moved. Sarah felt frozen behind the counter, her heart pounding in her chest. The man's eyes had locked onto her face, specifically onto her tattoo, but unlike the stares she usually received, his expression wasn't one of judgment or disgust. It was recognition. He approached the counter slowly, his footsteps measured and deliberate. When he reached Sarah, he stood there silently for what felt like an eternity, his eyes studying the pattern on her cheek. Sarah wanted to say something, anything, but words failed her. "Excuse me," the man finally said, his voice deep and controlled. "That tattoo on your face, may I ask where you got it?" Sarah's mouth went dry. This was the question she dreaded, yet somehow, coming from this man, it felt different. There was no mockery in his tone, no judgment. Only curiosity and something else she couldn't quite identify. It's from Samoa," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded slowly, his expression unchanged. "Samoa," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Were you stationed there?" "I was a Navy corpsman," Sarah admitted, surprised at how easily the words came. She rarely told people about her military service. The tattoo usually dominated any conversation about her past. A corpsman, the man said, and something shifted in his eyes. Respect, perhaps, or understanding. That's noble work. Not many people understand what corpsmen go through, especially deployed corpsmen. Sarah felt tears threatening to form. It had been so long since anyone had acknowledged her service without focusing on the tattoo first. "Thank you," she whispered. The man extended his hand. "Colonel James Bradford, United States Marine Corps, retired." Sarah shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of years of hard work. "Sarah Mitchell. It's an honor to meet you, sir." Colonel Bradford didn't release her hand immediately. Instead, he looked at her tattoo again, his expression growing more intense. "That pattern," he said quietly. "It's not just decorative, is it?" "It means something specific," Sarah nodded, unable to speak. "How did he know?" "I've seen that pattern before," the colonel continued. "Only once, and it was in circumstances I'll never forget." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "Tell me, Sarah Mitchell, were you ever in a village called Falealupo?" The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sarah gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. Falealupo. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 2 years, but it haunted her dreams every single night. The village, the fire, the screaming children, the impossible choice she had to make. "Yes," she breathed. "I was there." Colonel Bradford's face transformed. The professional military bearing cracked, revealing raw emotion underneath. "Then you're the one," he said, his voice thick. "You're the corpsman who saved my Marines." Sarah's vision blurred with tears. After all this time, after all the judgment and cruel words, someone finally understood. Someone finally knew the truth behind the mark on her face. The pharmacy suddenly felt too small, too confining for the weight of the moment. Sarah's hand shook as she gripped the counter, memories flooding back with overwhelming force. Colonel Bradford stood perfectly still, his military composure battling with the emotion threatening to break through. "I need to close up," Sarah said, her voice cracking. Can you wait, please?" The colonel nodded. "I've waited 2 years to find you. I can wait another 15 minutes. Sarah turned away, calling for Emma to help with closing procedures. Her mind raced as she mechanically completed the end-of-day tasks. Counting the cash register, logging off the computer system, checking that all medications were secured. Emma kept glancing at her with concern, but Sarah couldn't explain. Not yet. Not until she understood what was happening. Colonel Bradford browsed the store patiently, occasionally picking up items and setting them down again. Sarah noticed he moved with a slight limp, favoring his right leg. She wondered if that injury was from Falealupo, from that terrible night when everything went wrong. Finally, the last customer left and Emma departed through the back door. Sarah locked the front entrance and turned to face the colonel. They stood in the dim lighting of the closed pharmacy, 2 strangers connected by a night neither could forget. "I tried to find you," Colonel Bradford said quietly. "After we were evacuated, after the debriefing and the medical treatments, I searched everywhere. But your unit had moved on, and the Navy wasn't helpful with information. They said you'd been reassigned, then medically separated. The trail went cold. I didn't want to be found," Sarah admitted. "What happened there?" "I couldn't face it. I couldn't face any of it." The colonel moved closer, his expression gentle despite his stern military features. "Sarah, what you did that night saved 17 lives. 17 Marines who made it home because of your actions. Do you understand that?" Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face now. "I couldn't save them all. 3 died. 3 Marines died because I wasn't fast enough. Wasn't good enough. 3 died because we walked into an ambush in hostile territory during a humanitarian mission that went sideways," Colonel Bradford corrected firmly. 3 died because of bad intelligence and worse luck. Not because of you." The memories came rushing back with painful clarity. Sarah had been assigned to a Marine unit providing medical assistance to remote Samoan villages. It was supposed to be simple, peaceful work. They were delivering vaccines and basic medical supplies to communities devastated by a recent cyclone. Falealupo was the last village on their route, a small collection of homes tucked into the jungle on the western edge of the island. But someone had other plans. A local militant group, angry about foreign military presence, had laid a trap. The explosion came just as Sarah was treating a child for dehydration. The blast tore through the village center, collapsing buildings and sending shrapnel in every direction. Immediately, gunfire erupted from the tree line. Sarah had grabbed her medical kit and run toward the screaming. Marines were down, bleeding, dying. The training took over, pushing aside fear and focusing only on the next task. Stop the bleeding. Clear the airway. Start the IV. Move to the next casualty. She worked in the middle of the firefight, bullets cracking overhead while the Marines fought to protect her and the wounded. She triaged 20 casualties in under 10 minutes, making impossible decisions about who needed treatment first. 3 Marines died in her arms despite everything she tried. I remember you, Colonel Bradford said, pulling Sarah back to the present. I remember watching you work. You were like a machine, moving from casualty to casualty, never hesitating, never panicking. I had taken shrapnel to my leg, and when you got to me, you looked me in the eyes and said, "You're going to be fine, Colonel." I've got you. Sarah remembered that moment too. The Colonel had been bleeding badly, a piece of metal lodged near his femoral artery. One wrong move and he would have bled out in minutes. You stabilized me in less than a minute, the Colonel continued. Then you moved on to the next Marine. And the next. You didn't stop until the medevac helicopters arrived. Even then you kept working, making sure every wounded man was properly loaded and documented. That's my job, Sarah whispered. That's what corpsmen do. That's what the best corpsmen do, Colonel Bradford corrected. And what happened after? How did you end up back here hiding in a pharmacy? Sarah touched her tattoo gently, the raised lines familiar under her fingertips. After the evacuation, I fell apart. PTSD, they called it. I couldn't sleep. Couldn't eat. Every loud noise sent me into panic attacks. The Navy tried to help, but I was broken. They medically discharged me after 6 months. She paused, remembering the dark days after her discharge. Coming home had felt like failure. She had trained for combat medicine, excelled at it, saved lives. But the mental scars proved more difficult to heal than any physical wound. I went back to Samoa on my own, Sarah continued, 6 months after my discharge. I needed to understand, to find some kind of peace with what happened. I visited Falalupo, saw the village rebuilt. The people there, they didn't blame us for what happened. They remembered us bringing medicine and help. And the tattoo? Colonel Bradford asked gently. Sarah smiled through her tears. There was an elder in the village, a woman named Mele. She was the one who had invited us there in the first place. When I visited, she recognized me. She said I carried a heavy burden that wasn't mine to carry. She offered to perform a traditional tattooing ceremony, to mark me as family, to remind me that I was connected to something larger than my pain. The tattoo had taken 3 days to complete. The traditional method was painful, using handmade tools and natural ink. But Sarah had welcomed the pain, had seen it as a form of penance. Mele had explained each line's meaning as she worked. Protection, courage, service, remembrance. She told me that in their culture, facial tattoos are sacred, Sarah explained. They're not decoration. They're a record of who you are, what you've survived, what you've sacrificed. She said my face should carry the mark of what I'd done, so I would never forget the lives I saved, not just the ones I lost. Colonel Bradford was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly he unbuttoned the top buttons of his shirt and pulled the collar aside. There, on his chest, was a tattoo remarkably similar to Sarah's. Same style, same traditional Samoan design, though more elaborate and extensive. Sarah gasped. You went back too. 3 months after my physical therapy ended, the Colonel confirmed. I needed answers. I needed to thank the people who helped us, to honor the Marines we lost. Mele was there. She recognized me too. She said I was the second warrior to return seeking peace. She gave you the tattoo, Sarah said, understanding flooding through her. She said it would connect me to my men, to that place, to the sacrifice we all made. She was right. This tattoo has been both a burden and a blessing. People judge me for it, question my professionalism, wonder what kind of Marine officer would mark his body this way. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. All this time, she had believed she was alone in carrying this visible mark of her trauma and her service. But here stood a Marine colonel, a man who had commanded hundreds of troops, who had probably faced similar judgment and misunderstanding. How do you deal with it? Sarah asked. The stares, the comments, the way people treat you differently? Colonel Bradford smiled, a real smile that softened his stern features. I remind myself why I have it. I remind myself what it represents. And I surround myself with people who understand, or at least who are willing to try. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "Sarah, I didn't come to this pharmacy by accident. I've been searching for you for months. I finally tracked down your VA records. Found out you'd moved back to Riverside. I came here today to offer you something." Sarah took the business card with trembling fingers. The simple white card read, "Veterans Wellness Center, Colonel James Bradford, Director of Operations." Below that was an address in Asheville. "About 40 minutes from Riverside. I don't understand," Sarah said, looking up from the card. Colonel Bradford's expression was earnest. "After I retired from the Marines, I couldn't just sit around playing golf. Too many veterans struggling. Too many people like us who came home changed. I partnered with some other retired officers and medical professionals to create a wellness center specifically for combat veterans dealing with PTSD, physical injuries, and reintegration challenges." He gestured to his chest, where his tattoo lay hidden beneath his shirt again. "We focus on alternative therapies, traditional healing methods from cultures around the world, peer support from people who understand what combat does to a person. We don't judge. We don't tell people to just get over it. We meet veterans where they are and help them find their own path to healing." Sarah's heart began to race, though she wasn't sure if it was from hope or fear. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because we need you," the colonel said simply. "We have therapists, counselors, and peer support specialists. But we're missing a crucial piece. We need medical professionals who understand combat trauma from the inside, who can bridge the gap between physical and mental health care. We need a corpsman." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. A corpsman. Her identity, her purpose, the things she had walked away from because she believed she'd failed. "I can't," she whispered. "You don't understand. I'm broken. I panic when I hear loud noises. I have nightmares every single night. I'm on medication for anxiety and depression. How can I help other veterans when I can't even help myself?" Colonel Bradford's expression didn't change. "Do you think I don't have nightmares? Do you think I don't flinch when a car backfires? Sarah, every person working at our center is a combat veteran dealing with their own demons. That's exactly why we can help others. We understand from the inside." "But my tattoo," Sarah said, touching her cheek. "You've seen how people react to it. How can I work in healthcare looking like this? I can barely keep this pharmacy job." "At our center, your tattoo won't be a liability. It will be an asset," the colonel explained. "Many of the veterans we serve have visible scars, tattoos, injuries that make them feel like outsiders in civilian society. Seeing a medical professional who carries her own visible marks of service, who faces judgment but continues to serve anyway, that's powerful. That's inspirational." Sarah wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that her tattoo could be something other than a curse, that her past service still meant something, that she could still help people. But fear held her back, the same fear that had kept her trapped in this safe, small life for 2 years. "I need time to think," she said finally. Colonel Bradford nodded. "Of course. But before I go, I want you to know something. The 17 Marines you saved that night in Falealupo, they all made it home. Every single one of them. Some of them struggled, fought their own battles with PTSD and physical injuries. But they're alive because of you." He pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a photograph. It showed a group of Marines standing together, all wearing formal dress uniforms. Sarah recognized some of the faces, older now but unmistakable. These were the men she had treated that terrible night. "This was taken at our reunion last year," Colonel Bradford explained. "We get together every year on the anniversary. We honor the 3 we lost, and we celebrate the fact that we're still here. Every year we talk about the corpsman who saved us, the one who ran into the gunfire without hesitation. We've been looking for you, Sarah, all of us." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she stared at the photograph. These men were alive, healthy, standing together. She had given them that chance. "There's something else," the colonel continued. "One of those Marines, Sergeant Marcus Chen, he's now a psychiatric nurse at our wellness center. He credits you with saving his life twice, once in Falealupo when you stopped his bleeding, and once 2 years later when he was considering suicide. He remembered your words, remembered your determination to save him, and it gave him the strength to ask for help." Sarah couldn't speak. The weight of emotion was too heavy, too overwhelming. "Sergeant Chen would like to meet you," Colonel Bradford said gently. "If you're willing. He's wanted to say thank you for 3 years." Sarah nodded, unable to form words. The colonel placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Take your time deciding about the job offer. But please, come visit the center. Meet the team. See what we're building. You don't have to commit to anything. Just come and see. After the colonel left, Sarah sat in the dark pharmacy for a long time, his business card clutched in her hand. The silence was broken only by the hum of the refrigeration units and the distant sound of traffic outside. She thought about the past 2 years, about hiding, about accepting the judgment and the stares as her punishment for surviving when others died. She thought about Mele, the elder who had marked her face with sacred symbols. Mele had said the tattoo was a reminder of strength, not shame. But Sarah had worn it like a brand, a visible sign of her failure. That night, Sarah barely slept. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying her conversation with Colonel Bradford over and over. The idea of working with other veterans was terrifying. What if she couldn't handle it? What if being around trauma triggered her own issues? What if she failed them the way she believed she'd failed those 3 Marines? But beneath the fear was something else, something she hadn't felt in years: purpose. A tiny spark of the passion that had driven her to become a corpsman in the first place, the desire to help people, to make a difference, to use her skills for something meaningful. The next morning, Sarah called in sick to the pharmacy. It was the first time she'd taken a day off in 18 months. She drove to Asheville, following the GPS to an address in a quiet neighborhood north of downtown. The Veterans Wellness Center was housed in a converted warehouse, the brick building softened by landscaping and large windows that let in natural light. Sarah sat in her car for 20 minutes, gathering courage. Through the windows, she could see people moving around inside. Some walked with canes or wheelchairs. Others looked healthy on the outside but carried invisible wounds. She recognized the look in their eyes, the same haunted quality she saw in her own mirror every day. Finally, she got out of the car and walked to the front entrance. Her heart pounded as she pushed open the door. The interior was warm and welcoming, with comfortable furniture, soft lighting, and walls decorated with art created by veterans. A young woman sat at the reception desk, and she smiled when Sarah entered. "Welcome to the Veterans Wellness Center. How can I help you?" "I'm here to see Colonel Bradford," Sarah said, her voice barely steady. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I don't have an appointment, but he asked me to visit." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly when she noticed Sarah's tattoo, but not with judgment. With recognition. She stood up, revealing her own prosthetic leg. "Sarah Mitchell, the colonel has been hoping you'd come. Please have a seat. I'll let him know you're here." She paused, her expression warm. "I'm Lieutenant Davis, by the way. Army combat engineer, lost my leg to an IED in Afghanistan. And that tattoo on your face? It's beautiful. Traditional Samoan, right?" Sarah nodded, stunned. No one had called her tattoo beautiful in months. "My platoon worked with some Samoan Marines once," Lieutenant Davis continued. "Incredible warriors and their cultural traditions around marking important moments and sacrifices. That's powerful stuff. You must have one hell of a story." Before Sarah could respond, a door opened and Colonel Bradford emerged, his face breaking into a genuine smile when he saw her. "Sarah, you came. I'm so glad." He approached and shook her hand warmly. "Come on back. There are some people who want to meet you." Sarah followed Colonel Bradford through the center, her eyes taking in everything. The space was unlike any medical facility she'd seen before. There were traditional therapy rooms, but also areas for yoga, meditation, art therapy, and group activities. Veterans of all ages moved through the space, some laughing together, others quiet and withdrawn, but all seeming comfortable and safe. The colonel led her to a conference room where 3 people waited. Sarah's breath caught when she recognized the first man. He was older than she remembered, with a beard now and reading glasses perched on his nose. But his eyes were unmistakable. "Sergeant Chen," Sarah whispered. Marcus Chen stood up slowly, his hands shaking slightly. He had been 22 years old in Falealupo, barely old enough to buy a beer but responsible for leading a fire team. Now he was 25, and his eyes held the weight of experiences that aged him beyond his years. "Corpsman Mitchell," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd get the chance to say this. Thank you for saving my life." Sarah shook her head, tears already forming. "I was just doing my job." "You ran through gunfire to reach me," Marcus said, stepping closer. "I had shrapnel in my chest, punctured lung, couldn't breathe. I remember your face above mine, and you were so calm, so confident. You told me to stay with you, that I wasn't allowed to die on your watch. I held on to those words for years. He pulled up his shirt, revealing a long scar across his ribs. "This is where you put in the chest tube. The surgeon at Landstuhl said you saved my life with that field procedure. Another 5 minutes and I would have died from tension pneumothorax." Sarah remembered that moment with painful clarity. Marcus had been gasping for air, his chest rising on one side but not the other. She'd had to make a split-second decision to perform an emergency chest decompression in the middle of a firefight. Her hands had been steady then, guided by training and necessity. "I'm glad you made it," Sarah said simply, not trusting herself to say more. Colonel Bradford gestured to the other 2 people in the room. "Sarah, this is Dr. Jennifer Walsh, our lead psychologist, and Captain Roberto Sanchez, who runs our peer support program. They both served, both understand what you've been through." Dr. Walsh was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and silver threading through her dark hair. "Army psychologist, 3 tours in Iraq," she said, shaking Sarah's hand. "I treated soldiers with PTSD while dealing with my own trauma. I understand the challenge of being a healer who needs healing." Captain Sanchez was younger, maybe 30, with a warm smile and a noticeable tremor in his left hand. "Marine Corps infantry officer, wounded in Syria. Got a traumatic brain injury that ended my career. Spent 2 years angry at the world before I found this place and realized I could still serve. Just differently." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the acceptance, the understanding. These people weren't judging her. They were welcoming her as one of their own. "Please sit," Colonel Bradford said, gesturing to the conference table. "We want to talk to you about joining our team, but first we want you to understand what we do here and why it matters." For the next hour, they shared the center's mission and philosophy. They explained how traditional therapy often failed combat veterans because it was designed for civilian trauma. Combat veterans needed peers who understood, alternative approaches that honored their service, and practical skills for managing triggers and rebuilding lives. "We combine evidence-based treatments with cultural practices from warrior traditions around the world," Dr. Walsh explained. "Samoan, Native American, African, Asian healing practices that honor the warrior identity rather than trying to eliminate it. We teach veterans that they can be both warriors and peaceful civilians, that these identities can coexist." Marcus spoke up then. "When I first came here, I was suicidal. Traditional therapy wasn't working. I felt like no one understood. But then I met other Marines who had been in combat, who had nightmares, who struggled with guilt over surviving when others didn't. For the first time, I didn't feel alone." He looked at Sarah directly. "You saved my life in Falealupo, but this place saved my life again. Now I get to help other veterans find their way back. It's the most meaningful work I've ever done." Sarah's throat tightened with emotion. This was what she'd been missing, what she'd been craving since her discharge, a sense of purpose, of belonging, of still being able to serve. "What would my role be?" Sarah asked quietly. Colonel Bradford leaned forward. "We need a medical coordinator who understands combat medicine and trauma, someone who can assess the physical health needs of our clients, coordinate with VA medical services, and provide on-site medical support during therapy sessions when needed. But more importantly, we need someone who can bridge the gap between physical and mental health. Many veterans come to us with chronic pain, injuries, and physical limitations that complicate their mental health recovery," Dr. Walsh added. "We need someone who can address those physical issues while understanding the psychological component. A corpsman is perfect because you're trained to treat the whole person, not just isolated symptoms." "And your tattoo," Captain Sanchez said gently. "It tells veterans right away that you're not a typical healthcare worker. You've been somewhere dark. You've faced something hard. You carry visible marks of your service. That creates instant credibility and trust." Sarah touched her tattoo unconsciously. All this time, she'd seen it as a liability. These people saw it as an asset, as proof of her journey, as a bridge to connect with others who felt marked by their service. "I'm scared," Sarah admitted. "I still have nightmares. I still panic sometimes. I'm on medication. I'm not fully healed myself." "None of us are," Dr. Walsh said gently. "Healing from combat trauma isn't about reaching some finish line where you're perfectly okay. It's about learning to live with what you've experienced, finding meaning in it and using your experience to help others. Some of our best staff members still go to therapy themselves. That's not a weakness. It's wisdom." Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where several veterans were engaged in a group meditation session. "Corpsman, remember what you told me in Falealupo? You said, "You're not allowed to die on my watch." Well, I'm saying the same thing to you now. You're not allowed to give up on yourself. You have too much to offer. Sarah felt something break open inside her chest like ice thawing after a long winter. For 2 years she'd been hiding, punishing herself, accepting judgment as her due. But maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe her service still mattered. Maybe her scars, visible and invisible, could help others instead of just weighing her down. "I need to give notice at the pharmacy," Sarah said, her voice stronger now. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Colonel Bradford smiled, understanding flooding his features. "Does that mean you're accepting our offer?" Sarah took a deep breath, feeling equal parts terrified and hopeful. "Yes, I am. I don't know if I'll be good at this. I don't know if I can handle the intensity of working with trauma every day. But I want to try. I need to try." The room erupted in smiles and congratulations. Marcus came around the table and pulled Sarah into a careful hug. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for saving my life. And thank you for giving other veterans the same chance." As Sarah left the center that afternoon, she felt different. Lighter, somehow, despite the weight of responsibility she'd just accepted. She stopped by a storefront window on her way to the car and looked at her reflection. The tattoo on her face caught the afternoon light, the delicate lines standing out against her skin. For the first time in 2 years, she didn't see it as a mark of shame or failure. She saw it as Melly had intended, a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and service. A reminder that she had survived something terrible and had helped others survive too. A bridge between the warrior she had been and the healer she could still become. Sarah pulled out her phone and called the pharmacy manager, requesting a meeting to discuss her resignation. Then she called her therapist, asking for an extra session to discuss her decision and prepare for the challenges ahead. She wasn't running away from her issues. She was running toward purpose, toward meaning, toward the chance to serve again. The first week at the Veterans Wellness Center was harder than Sarah had anticipated. She arrived each morning with determination, but by afternoon the weight of so many traumatic stories threatened to crush her. Every veteran who walked through the door carried pain, and Sarah felt all of it like a physical burden. There was Derek, a former Army Ranger who had lost both legs in Afghanistan and struggled with phantom pain so severe he couldn't sleep. There was Alicia, an Air Force pilot who had developed crippling anxiety after a near crash during a mission and could no longer drive without panic attacks. There was James, a Navy SEAL who had witnessed his best friend die beside him and blamed himself for surviving. Each story was a mirror, reflecting Sarah's own trauma back at her. The nightmares intensified. She found herself crying in the bathroom between sessions, overwhelmed by the depth of suffering around her. Several times she considered quitting, convinced she had made a terrible mistake. But something kept her coming back. Maybe it was the moment when Derek, after weeks of resistance, finally agreed to try the alternative pain management techniques Sarah suggested and reported his first full night of sleep in 3 years. Maybe it was watching Alicia complete a driving exposure therapy session with tears streaming down her face, hands gripping the steering wheel, but finishing the circuit around the parking lot. Maybe it was James, who barely spoke for his first month at the center, finally opening up during a group session about his survivor's guilt. Sarah began to understand what Colonel Bradford had meant about wounded healers being the most effective. When Derek saw her tattoo and asked about it, she told him the truth. She shared her own struggles with guilt, her own nightmares, her own journey toward accepting that survival wasn't something to apologize for. Derek listened with tears in his eyes and said it was the first time anyone had talked to him like a person instead of a patient. The center's approach was different from traditional medical settings. Sarah wasn't expected to maintain clinical distance. She was encouraged to share her story when appropriate, to be vulnerable about her own struggles, to acknowledge that healing was a journey rather than a destination. It felt wrong at first, breaking all the professional boundaries she'd been taught in her medical training, but it worked. One afternoon, about 6 weeks into her new job, Sarah was conducting a health assessment with a new client. The man was in his early 30s, Marine Corps infantry, recently separated after serving 8 years. His intake form listed chronic back pain, insomnia, and anger management issues. When he walked into Sarah's office, she immediately recognized the defensive posture, the wary eyes, the barely controlled tension in his shoulders. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she said, extending her hand. Former Navy corpsman. The Marine's expression softened slightly at the word corpsman. Marines and Navy corpsmen shared a special bond forged in combat. He shook her hand with a firm grip. "Corporal Mike Johnson," he said. Then his eyes focused on her tattoo, and his entire demeanor changed. "That's a traditional Samoan tattoo. Did you serve in the Pacific?" "I did," Sarah confirmed. "Got this during a very difficult time in my life. It's a long story. I was stationed in Okinawa," Mike said, sitting down and actually relaxing in his chair. "Worked with some Samoan Marines. They taught me about the significance of traditional tattoos, how they're not just decoration but a record of who you are, what you've endured." Sarah smiled. "Exactly. This tattoo tells my story without me having to say a word. Some people judge me for it, but the people who matter understand." Mike nodded slowly, his guarded expression crumbling. "I have tattoos that people judge too. Got my whole squad's names on my back after we lost 3 guys in Helmand Province. People at job interviews see the ink coming up my neck and assume I'm some kind of troublemaker. They don't ask what it means. They just judge." "Tell me about your squad," Sarah said gently, pulling out a notepad. This wasn't in the standard health assessment protocol, but she'd learned that sometimes you had to address the emotional wound before you could treat the physical one. For the next hour, Mike talked. He shared stories about his Marines, about the friends he'd lost, about the guilt that ate at him every day. He described the back pain that doctors said was muscular, but that Mike knew was connected to the stress of carrying so much grief. He talked about the nightmares that destroyed his sleep and the anger that ruined his relationships. Sarah listened, really listened, in the way only someone who had lived through similar trauma could. She didn't offer platitudes or easy solutions. She simply witnessed his pain and validated his experience. "The physical pain and the emotional pain are connected," Sarah finally said. "Your body is holding trauma. That's not weakness or imagination. That's how trauma works. We can address both through the programs here, but it requires you to trust the process and trust the people helping you." Mike looked at her tattoo again. "Can I ask you something personal? Why did you get it on your face?" "That's hardcore. Most people hide their meaningful tattoos where employers can't see them." Sarah touched the tattoo lightly. "Because hiding felt like lying. This marks me as someone who has survived something significant, someone who carries the weight of difficult choices. I spent 2 years trying to hide from my past, trying to blend into normal civilian life. It didn't work. This tattoo reminds me every single day that I'm not normal, and that's okay. My experiences changed me, and pretending otherwise was making me sick." "Does it get easier?" Mike asked quietly. "Living with what we've seen, what we've done?" "It gets different," Sarah answered honestly. "The nightmares don't disappear completely, but they lose some of their power. The guilt doesn't vanish, but you learn to carry it differently. You find meaning in your survival. You help other people who are where you once were. That's what this place is about." Mike nodded, wiping at his eyes roughly. "Okay, I'm willing to try, but I've been to therapy before and it didn't help. Civilian therapists don't get it." "Everyone here gets it," Sarah assured him. "We've all been where you are. Colonel Bradford, who runs this place, he's the Marine officer I served with when I got this tattoo. Marcus Chen, one of our peer counselors, I pulled shrapnel out of his chest during a firefight. Dr. Walsh treated soldiers in combat zones while dealing with her own trauma. We understand from the inside." Over the following months, Sarah watched Mike transform. It wasn't a quick or easy process. There were setbacks, moments of resistance, days when he wanted to quit. But slowly, through group therapy, peer support, physical therapy, and alternative healing practices, he began to heal. The anger softened. The pain decreased. The nightmares, while still present, became less frequent. Sarah's own healing progressed alongside her clients. Working at the center forced her to confront her trauma daily, but it also gave her tools to process it. She participated in the same therapies she recommended to others. She joined veteran support groups. She learned meditation and mindfulness practices from Captain Sanchez. She worked with Dr. Walsh on reframing her guilt about the Marines who died in Falealupo. One evening, about 4 months into her work at the center, Sarah stayed late to finish paperwork. Colonel Bradford knocked on her office door carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you could use this," he said, handing her a cup. "Thanks," Sarah said, accepting it gratefully. "Just finishing up Mike Johnson's progress notes." "He's doing really well." The colonel sat down across from her desk. "You're doing excellent work here, Sarah. Better than I even hoped." You have a gift for connecting with veterans in a way that helps them open up and trust the process. Sarah felt herself blush slightly. I'm just doing what others did for me. You, Marcus, Dr. Walsh. Everyone here helped me see that my service still mattered, that I could still contribute despite my wounds. I'm paying that forward. Your tattoo was controversial at first, Colonel Bradford admitted. Some of our board members worried it would make clients uncomfortable or seem unprofessional. But it's become one of your greatest assets. Veterans see it and immediately know you're different, that you've walked a harder path. Sarah smiled. Remember when I was terrified of how people would judge me for it? When I thought it made me unemployable. And now? Now I understand what Melly tried to tell me. This tattoo isn't a mark of shame. It's a badge of honor. It represents the hardest thing I've ever done and the most important. It connects me to a culture that honors warriors and their sacrifices. It reminds me every day that I survived for a reason. Colonel Bradford pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a photo. It was from the annual Falealupo reunion, showing all the surviving Marines from that mission. But this year's photo was different. In the front row kneeling were 3 new faces, young children. Those are Sergeant Chen's kids, the colonel explained, twins born last year. He named his daughter Sarah after you. He wanted his children to carry the name of the corpsman who gave him the chance to become a father. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She had saved Marcus's life in a moment of crisis, never imagining the ripple effects of that action. Now there were children in the world who existed because she had run into gunfire to save their father. The opportunity to expand the program felt like both a gift and a responsibility. Sarah spent the next several months traveling to different cities, meeting with VA administrators, training new staff members, and sharing the lessons she had learned. Each new center brought her into contact with more veterans whose stories echoed her own. More faces marked by service and sacrifice. In Atlanta, she met a former Army medic who had also gotten a meaningful tattoo after a deployment trauma. The woman had been hiding it under makeup for 3 years, terrified of judgment. After hearing Sarah's story, she stopped covering it up and found that her visible scar became a conversation starter with the veterans she treated, building instant trust and rapport. In Seattle, Sarah worked with a Marine Corps corpsman who had left medicine entirely after his discharge, convinced his PTSD made him unfit to care for others. Sarah shared her own journey, the months of doubt and fear, and the realization that wounded healers often understood suffering in ways that made them more effective, not less. In Denver, she encountered resistance from traditional medical professionals who questioned her methods, her qualifications, and her appearance. An older doctor openly criticized her tattoo during a training session, suggesting it undermined the professionalism of military medicine. Sarah stood before the room of skeptical faces and made a choice. Instead of defending herself with credentials or anger, she simply told her story. She described Falealupo, the night that changed everything, the impossible choices she had to make. She talked about the guilt that nearly destroyed her, the judgment she faced, and the moment Colonel Bradford walked into a pharmacy and showed her that her visible scars could be sources of strength. Traditional medicine says we should maintain boundaries between ourselves and our patients, Sarah explained. We shouldn't share personal information. We shouldn't show vulnerability. We should project confidence and competence at all times. But combat veterans don't respond well to that approach. They've been judged by civilian society for being broken, for not fitting in, for carrying visible and invisible wounds. When they see a healthcare provider who also carries scars, who admits to struggling, who treats them as equals rather than patients, something shifts. She gestured to her tattoo. This mark on my face is controversial. Some people find it unprofessional or inappropriate. But to a veteran who feels like an outsider in civilian society, who feels judged for their own scars and tattoos and wounds, seeing a medical professional who also carries permanent marks of service creates immediate connection. They know I understand from the inside. The doctor who had criticized her raised his hand. But doesn't that blur professional boundaries in a way that could be harmful? It creates different boundaries, Sarah replied. I don't share details of my trauma with clients unless it serves their healing. I maintain appropriate professional distance in terms of not socializing with clients or becoming personally involved in their lives. But I acknowledge our shared experience. I validate their struggles by admitting I face similar challenges. And research shows that peer support and shared experience are among the most effective interventions for PTSD. By the end of the training, Even the skeptical doctor approached Sarah with a new understanding. He shared that his own son, a veteran, had struggled to engage with traditional mental health services but had thrived in a peer support environment. Sarah's presentation had helped him understand why. As the months passed, Sarah watched the network of wellness centers grow. Each location saved lives, helped veterans rebuild, and created communities of understanding and support. The success rate was remarkable. Veterans who had been through multiple failed treatment programs found healing in these spaces that honored their warrior identity while addressing their wounds. Sarah's own healing continued. The nightmares became less frequent. The panic attacks, while still occasional, were manageable. She developed a support network of other combat veterans who understood her struggles without judgment. She continued her own therapy, viewing it not as a sign of weakness but as an essential part of maintaining her ability to help others. 1 year after starting at the Veterans Wellness Center, Sarah received a phone call that would change everything again. It was Mele, the Samoan elder, who had given her the tattoo. Mele explained that she was coming to the United States for a cultural exchange program and wanted to visit Sarah. They met at a small restaurant in Asheville. Mele was older, her face deeply lined, but her eyes held the same wisdom and kindness Sarah remembered. They embraced like family because that's what the tattoo had made them. "I have followed your journey," Mele said as they sat down. "The Marines you served with, they visited our village and told me what you were doing now. They said you are healing warriors, using both your medical knowledge and the lessons of our culture." Sarah nodded, touching her tattoo unconsciously. "Everything you taught me about this mark, about carrying my story with honor rather than shame, it changed my life. I was hiding before. Now I stand visible," Mele smiled. "That is the purpose of sacred marking, to make visible what is already true. You were always strong, always brave, always a healer. The tattoo simply made it impossible for you to forget or deny those truths." They talked for hours. Mele shared news from Falealupo, how the village had continued to heal and grow. She told Sarah that the 3 Marines who died were honored there, their names inscribed on a memorial in the village center. The community remembered them as heroes who came to help, not as casualties of war. "Do you have regrets about the tattoo?" Mele asked at one point. "Has it brought you trouble?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "It brought me judgment and lost opportunities. It cost me jobs and relationships. People stare at me every day, and some of them see only the mark, not the person. But it also brought me here to this work, to these veterans who need someone who understands. It connected me to Colonel Bradford and the Marines I saved. It reminds me daily of my purpose. So no, I have no regrets." Mele reached across the table and placed her weathered hand over Sarah's. "You have honored the mark well. You have turned your pain into purpose, your trauma into healing. That is the warrior's path." Before Mele left, she performed a small ceremony in Sarah's apartment, blessing her work and renewing the spiritual connection the tattoo represented. It wasn't about religion, but about honoring the sacred nature of service, sacrifice, and healing. 2 years after starting at the Veterans Wellness Center, Sarah stood before a gathering of several hundred people. The event was a fundraiser for expanding the Wellness Center network, and Sarah had been asked to speak. She looked out at the crowd, seeing veterans and supporters, military families and civilian allies. Colonel Bradford sat in the front row, pride evident on his face. Marcus Chen was there with his wife and the twins. Mike Johnson attended with his new girlfriend, his face peaceful in a way Sarah remembered from their first meeting. Sarah began her speech not with statistics or program outcomes, but with a story. She described walking into a pharmacy wearing a facial tattoo, carrying the weight of trauma and failure, believing she had nothing left to offer. She talked about the judgment she faced, the whispers and stares, the sense of being permanently marked as different. Then she described the moment Colonel Bradford walked through that pharmacy door and changed everything. How he recognized her tattoo, shared his own, and showed her that visible scars could be sources of strength. How he offered her a chance to serve again, to use her wounds to help others heal. "This tattoo on my face has been called unprofessional, inappropriate, and disturbing," Sarah said, her voice strong and clear. "I've been told it makes me unemployable, that I should cover it with makeup, that I'll regret it forever. But this mark represents the most important thing I've ever done. It honors a promise I made to wounded Marines that I would do everything in my power to save them. It connects me to a culture that understands the sacred nature of warrior service, and it bridges the gap between me and the veterans I now serve, creating instant trust and understanding. She was changed. She was marked. She was different. And that difference, that visible evidence of her journey through trauma and survival, was exactly what made her effective at helping others walk similar paths. Her wound had become her strength. Her scar had become her bridge. Her shame had transformed into purpose. Sarah touched her tattoo gently, a gesture of gratitude and acceptance. She had stopped apologizing for her face, stopped explaining herself to people who couldn't understand, stopped trying to fit into a world that wasn't built for warriors coming home. Instead, she had created a space where visible and invisible scars were honored, where healing happened in community, and where service continued in new forms. The teenagers who had mocked her at the pharmacy seemed like a distant memory now. Their judgment couldn't touch her anymore. She knew her worth. She knew her story. She knew that the mark on her face represented courage, sacrifice, and an ongoing commitment to serving those who had served. As Sarah drove home that night, she felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years. The nightmares would probably never completely disappear. The memories of Falealupo would always carry weight. But she had learned to carry those burdens differently, to find meaning in survival, to honor the fallen by serving the living. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Mele back in Samoa. The message was simple but profound. You have become the healer you were always meant to be. The mark was just the beginning. The work is eternal. Walk in peace, warrior daughter. Sarah smiled, tears streaming down her face, and drove toward home with a heart full of gratitude, purpose, and hope.